who worked at the inn in St. Mary's City were indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who had signed a contract or indenture in which they agreed to work in the colony without pay, usually for around 6 years, in exchange for free transportation to America. Indentured servants were common in all the colonies. Usually, they were people who had decided to leave England because of poverty. Although indentured servants provided a lot of cheap labor in Maryland and the other colonies, they were legally free to go as they pleased once their contracts had been fulfilled. In fact, most of them stayed on to start their own farms and to raise families. In contrast, the colony's legal system bound the slaves who did most of the work on the plantations to a lifetime of forced labor. Religious struggles erupted in Maryland not long after it was founded. They occurred mainly because Catholics controlled its government, yet they made up only a small fraction of its population. This caused resentment among many colonists. When Puritans, who strongly disliked Catholics, flooded into Maryland, violence broke out. To soothe his colonists, Lord Baltimore replaced the Catholic governor with a Protestant one. And even more importantly, in 1649, here at the colony's capital in St. Mary's City, Maryland enacted a Religious Toleration Act which guaranteed freedom of worship to all Christian faiths. The Toleration Act was the first step ever taken to promote freedom of religion on the American soil. In 1649, the same year that Maryland was enacting its Toleration Act, King Charles I of England was beheaded for treason by order of the Parliament, and for the next decade, England had no king. But then the monarchy was restored under the dead king's son, King Charles II. The new king awarded the proprietorship of the land south of Virginia, known as Carolina, to 8 loyal friends to thank them for their help in bringing him to the throne. 2 separate colonies, North and South Carolina, were later carved from the original Carolina colony. North Carolina was the site of England's first attempt at colonization in America. It all started in 1584, when Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to a vast region of land along the east coast of America to her friend Sir Walter Raleigh. Explorers from England searched for a good site for a colony, and they selected Roanoke Island just off the mainland of North Carolina. The following year, over 100 men and boys arrived at the island. Their goal was to create a base for supplying English warships. But they soon realized that the island's shallow waters would make running such a base impossible. And so they abandoned their mission and returned to England. The next attempt at colonization happened 2 years later, when a group of 117 men, women, and children sailed off to colonize land further north in Virginia. But due to some confusion, they ended up at Roanoke Island too. After several months on the island, there were struggles with the Native Americans, and the colonists needed more supplies. So the ship that had brought them to America returned to England to get them. However, a major war broke out between Spain and England, and the English needed every ship they could find. As a result, 3 years passed by before the supply ship could safely return to Roanoke Island. When the ship finally got back in 1590, the island was deserted. In fact, the only sign of the colonists were the letters C-R-O, carved in a tree. These letters may have been a reference to Croatoan Island to the south. But to this day, the fate of the Roanoke colonists of North Carolina remains a great mystery, and no trace of them has ever been found. By the time the 8 Lords Proprietors began to govern North Carolina in 1663, a small area not far from Roanoke Island had already been settled by a few people who had been indentured servants and small-time tobacco farmers in Virginia. The town of Bath, seen here, is the oldest town in North Carolina, founded in 1705. 3 years after it was founded, Bath had 12 houses, a shipyard, a mill for grinding grain, and 50 residents. The town was frequently visited by a man named Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard, a pirate who terrorized shipping lanes along the southern coast of America. During its early days, North Carolina's main exports were tobacco, furs, and forest products for wooden ships, such as timbers, turpentine, pitch, resin, and tar. Eventually, North Carolina changed from being a privately owned proprietorship colony to a royal colony. The king built a beautiful palace for his governor, William Tyrone, right before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and for a short time, Tyrone Palace served as the home of North Carolina's colonial legislature. But another purpose of this fine building was to remind the colonists of England's strength and greatness during a time of growing political turmoil in America. The colony of South Carolina, founded in 1663, was first settled on and around a narrow peninsula of land where 2 great rivers flow into the ocean. The city that was built here, starting in 1670, was named Charleston, in honor of King Charles II. Charleston eventually became the 4th largest city in the English colonies, and one of the wealthiest. In contrast, the colony of North Carolina never had a large city. The first colonists in South Carolina arrived by ship from England late in the year 1669 and settled near here on the banks of the Ashley River. They established small farms, traded in furs, and exported forest products for wooden ships as the settlers in the north were doing. Starting in the 1680s, persecuted Protestants from Europe immigrated to South Carolina to farm and find religious freedom. The flat, swampy South Carolina low country was perfect for growing rice, and it was mainly this crop that brought them prosperity. Later on, planters in South Carolina raised a plant called indigo, from whose leaves a valuable blue dye is derived. Eventually, indigo became a major export of the colony as well. Rice was grown on huge plantations, and it required a large number of workers to produce. As a result, thousands of African slaves were brought in, so that by 1699, there were 4 black slaves for every white person in the colony. Slavery on this scale resulted in the creation of a powerful upper class made up of extremely wealthy planters, many of whom lived in and around Charleston. This mansion, called Drayton Hall, is a good example of a wealthy South Carolina planter's house. It stands on the banks of a river and once overlooked the plantation's huge rice fields. Planters who lived in enormous houses like this one liked to show off their wealth in other ways, too. In fact, visitors to a plantation house usually had to pass down a long drive along which stood row after row of slave cabins that were intentionally placed there so the visitors would be impressed with how many expensive slaves the owner possessed. Those seen here at Boone Hall Plantation are only a third of the 27 cabins that once stood here. These cabins were for the use of household and skilled craftsman slaves alone. Cabins of the much more lowly field slaves stood further away from the house. The colony of Georgia was founded in 1732. It was the last of England's American colonies, and it was the only one founded in the 18th century. Georgia was created in the area of disputed land that lay between the colony of South Carolina and Spanish Florida. But more than a decade before the charter was even granted for the colony,